My name is Levin Visman. I'm the managing director of IBM, and I think that I'm a typical product of my generation. And what does that mean? That means that I work for a multinational company for already 25 years. Actually, last March, I joined the quarter century club of IBM. Probably something that you will never achieve, and I will explain a little bit later why that is the case. Probably because you're another generation and you have other behavior. So I work for 25 years for this company, and I will explain you a little bit why generations matter. Generations matter because people from a generation behave in a different way when they are in a specific situation. So for example, collaboration between generations can be tensed. And hopefully I will be able to explain a little bit more about that later on. Let me go back to my own generation, Generation X, and let me share a little bit about that generation. So typically, we are born after the boomers. So you all know boomers, after the World War, and my generation, my parents were, let's say, in the hippie time. So, for example, they were part of a community with some kind of alternative belief. So it was not Bhagwan, but something similar. So flower power, all those kind of things. So that was my youth. And after my study, and that is typical for my generation as well, people start to focus on their career. And they are willing to invest in their career. So they are fine to suffer for a few years before they move on to the next level. That is really typical for my generation. We saw the start of the internet, for example, which will have a huge impact on how the world will change. And what we see as well is that those people are at the moment in those top positions in many companies and organizations, typically, and that's also the case for me. Parents are dying, kids are growing up, so that is more or less the situation that I'm in. And what we also see is people start to do strange things. So all of a sudden they start to collect wine, cook some Italian food, buy an expensive race bike, and sometimes also do other things. I think that is very typical for my generation, but let me now go back to my situation here in Groningen. So in the summer of 2019, I was responsible for a set of clients within IBM in the energy and utility sector and telco. And what is really important there, if you are responsible for a set of clients, is that you invest in building a relationship. And normally within a large multinational company, you give a sort of a commitment for a few years. So you do this job not for 6 months, but for example, for 2 or 3 years. And when they approached me to become the director of the IBM location here in Groningen, I was in the job just for 6 months. So I said, yeah, well, I cannot do that because I just joined. I mean, I just started to invest in building those relations. It is too early for me to move on. Nevertheless, I was flattered because I know that this was a very special team here in Groningen. So I said no. After the summer, they came back. They asked me again. I said no again, but when they asked for the third time, I thought, okay, perhaps I should say yes. And I will explain you what is so typical about this team here. So this is a group of around 200 software developers from Generation Y and Generation Z. Most of them started their career here in IBM after graduating from the Rijksuniversiteit Groningen, from the RUG, and they joined this company. So let me now explain a little bit more about the differences or about the characteristics of Generation Y. So that is typically the generation that was born late 80s, beginning of the 90s. Probably some of you, but I think that most of you will probably belong to Generation Z. So Generation Y is the generation where the parents wanted their kids to have a better life than they had. That is an important thing. This generation is very good in communicating. They feel very comfortable sharing experiences, comparing to each other. They connect to people very, very easily. And what is also very special is that they are very strong in multitasking. So for example, they listen to music, they check their socials, they work on 2 projects at the same time, and they chat with their friends all at the same time. That is sometimes very difficult for my generation to understand how that works. Generation Z are the digital natives. So those people never lived in a time without computers. They never lived in a time without globalization. So everybody was always, there were no boundaries. So everybody was always connected to the rest of the world. What also makes this group very special is that they are very good in connecting virtually, but they don't always feel comfortable talking to people. So the verbal communication is sometimes a challenge. Of course, this is not the case for everyone, but in general, this is definitely the case. So let me now go back to my own situation. So I started the job here in Groningen, and the team was really afraid that this corporate guy would come over and sort of change their whole culture. So it was a group of young people, and I come from an environment where, let's say, old white guys from above 50 are sort of the standard. So you do deals at the coffee machine, you know, that is how it works. And here it was completely different. People are in a creative environment, working too closely together, agile working, etc., etc. So they were afraid that things would really change. So my first step was having lunch, actually in this building with our workers' council, and I approached this quite openly. So I think that already after the first lunch, they feel sort of comfortable. And then the next step was very interesting because every month within the location here, we have an all hands. Normally we share operational results, but this case, it was about saying goodbye to the former directors and for me introducing myself to the team. And what was special here is that the former directors, they started this company here in Groningen. They hired everyone. So they were more or less seen as the mom and dad of this team, and now this new guy comes in. So what I did, and I was lucky, I talked to all the managers. And I asked them what they like and what they didn't like, and I also asked them what they would like me to give them. And many of them told me, please give us more responsibility. And actually, I like that a lot. I don't want to do everything myself. So for me, it was really positive that they were willing to pick up more responsibility. And I was lucky because only 2 weeks after I started, COVID hit us and we were all in lockdown. That was very unfortunate. So let me now come back to the generations. So what I learned is that there are other things besides work that are really important. So for example, the Generation Z, they are not so much interested in a career. For them, it is not really important to do only one thing. They want to do several things. So we try to also include that a little bit in our own organization. So for example, we have many committees. Sports committee, culture committee, communications committee. And if you have an events committee, for example, how I used to work, or how my, let's say, first years of my career looked like, is that we had a tough week, worked 50, 60 hours a week. At the end of the week, we had a beer together, and then it was time for the weekend. So that was enough, that was good. But now we have committees that are organizing really different things. Of course, there is still a group of people that likes to party, but there are also people that like to do board games or video games. So we also organize that. And I think that that is really important. Really try to understand what drives people and where their interest is. What I also learned is ask people what motivates them. So, and that can be different from person to person, and of course from generation to generation. And the last thing, and then I will stop, giving and receiving feedback is crucial. If you want to grow yourself, if you want to become better, then ask for feedback, but also feel comfortable giving feedback. So what I try to do is sort of create an environment where all those people coming from different backgrounds and from different generations, they feel safe, so that I can enable them to perform at the best as possible. So once again, and then I will stop, listen to each other, be open, try to learn something from another generation, and think then you can really create a high-performing team and have fun together.